Good afternoon, everybody. Hello there. Testing 1, 2, 3. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this special edition of the Education Policy Colloquium series, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance at Kennedy School, which, as you can all see, obviously today is being co-hosted by the Graduate School of Education. Treat for us. My name is Jim Pfizer. I'm an academic visitor at Kennedy School and a former Massachusetts Secretary of Education. And it's a pleasure to be working alongside West, Peterson, and Pepchi. But I'm equally grateful today because this session is being co-hosted by Professor So. And it's an honor to not only be here today, but an honor to serve the board of early education and care, which is years. After today, we've got just one more session, the second to last session of the semester. It'll be Thursday at noon back at Kennedy School in Taubman. We will be talking about the impact of government in particular. So I think that'll be it. Conclusion of our series. As always, find the full schedule on the website. Videos Today's session will be led by Dr. Anamarie Whitaker, and it's focused on the impact of early education, specifically with regard to literacy. Now, it's generally taken for granted that one of the reasons why only about half of educators are reading proficiency is a lack of following but needless to say, the title of today's session, Higher School Program, much less effective, brings that assumption into question. We're thrilled to have Dr. Whitaker here today to tell us about the research findings and to help us. Anamarie Whitaker is the assistant professor of the Education Policy Program. She was engaged in Irvine. Prior to joining the University of Delaware, explanation of the research. After Anamarie's comments, we should have time for the questions. And we'll even kick that off and hopefully moderate this. And although we'll obviously give priority to folks who are in the room, questions and comments. We'd also like to hear from folks who are on Zoom. I'm not sure how many people are out there, but I'm sure there are a few. And so we'll try to keep track of the chat. So if you've got any questions or comments, put them in there. We'll try to get to them. We are essentially being recorded and posted on the website, so keep that in mind. So your comments are reflected in the record. And with that, it's my privilege to turn it over to Anamarie.
Thank you.
When you go to you'll see the lights on the wall. The audio we heard really important recorded when you press the button and speak into the mic. Done, press the button. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. It really is an honor. I'm excited to share my paper with you all, and I know that there will be lots of time for question and answer after my presentation, but if you do have any clarifying questions today while I am talking, please don't hesitate to interrupt. Okay. Before I get started, I do want to emphasize this paper is the result of a really strong collaboration between many researchers. We discussed and debated these topics over and over and over. And this strong collaboration really helped us, I think, turn this into a stronger paper. And I do want to highlight one of my co-authors, Emma Hart. She is a graduate student at Teachers College. She'll be on the job market next year. And she really helped us think a lot harder about these topics and was just a wonderful contributor to this paper and to all of our other studies. This is a working paper. It is available to be downloaded through the Annenberg Institute. And we are at the revision stage of this paper, so we are seeking feedback, and your comments will be valuable right now specifically. So feel free at the end of this presentation or after to follow up with me by email. And really look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments. So to get started, so why are we focused on preschool effectiveness right now? Recently, in the past 5 to 10 years, there's been a handful of high quality studies that have come out with longer term effects of preschool education, showing mixed results in terms of children's achievement in the longer term. And importantly, these results differ from what the classical or demonstration programs of Perry and Abecedarian showed. And it maybe is not surprising to you in this room that the results might differ. Perry and Abecedarian were conducted in the 1960s and 70s. They were small scale researcher designed studies with high per child costs and lots of intensive services for children, as well as academic programs. So while we think that it may not be surprising the results may differ, a lot of the promise of early childhood education policy is built on these longer term effects from these programs, including Perry, Abecedarian, and earlier cohorts of Head Start. I won't spend too much time going over the Perry and Abecedarian findings, but the skills that Perry and Abecedarian persistently promoted across childhood were achievement. So both Perry and Abecedarian had longer term findings for children's academic achievement. IQ measures in Perry faded out, but in Abecedarian it was consistent. Social emotional was consistent in Perry across middle childhood as well. Abecedarian, there was fade out and also some potential mixed evidence around negative effects on children's aggression, but those were not continuously found when measured. Health, unfortunately, was not measured in Perry and Abecedarian in childhood. So I do want to emphasize here that both Perry and Abecedarian show significant academic achievement outcomes after the end of the program and into middle childhood. Additionally, again, as we talk about this, and many of you probably know this, Perry and Abecedarian had really strong effects into adulthood. Perry and Abecedarian both promoted academic achievement in adulthood, years of education, employment, income, and reductions in crime. There were some differences by gender, but really the key takeaway from this table is that there was clear long-term effects of participating in ages 3, 4 in Perry and from birth to 5 in Abecedarian on adult outcomes, ages 27 through 40. Now turning to more modern day programs and evaluations of those programs. I focus today and in the paper only on our most rigorous evaluations of programs. So those that have a lottery-based design or those that are randomized controlled trial studies. So focusing on our most promising evidence, it comes from the Boston pre-K study, particularly Gray, Loeb, and colleagues. And in this Boston study, the cohorts for attending pre-K were from 1997 to 2003. And why that's important is because it's before the big quality enhancements were put in place into the Boston pre-K program. Children were randomly assigned through a lottery to either receive their choice of pre-K or not, and then followed up with administrative data through post-secondary education. And importantly, what we see in Boston is that there were no immediate or intermediate outcomes, significant outcomes. There were no effects on children's academic achievement in elementary, middle, or high school. Positive effects start to emerge in this program, again, for children that participated in the Boston pre-K program compared with those that were not assigned to participate in the program. We see positive effects on behavior, so reductions in suspension and juvenile incarceration. We also see positive effects on SAT taking, high school graduation, and college going. Also important to note is that we don't have end of treatment impacts for this study. We don't know how children were doing at the end of that immediate preschool year. All we have is starting in 3rd grade, where we see null results until high school problem behaviors again, in the positive direction, showing that pre-K was resulting in a reduction in suspension and juvenile incarceration, and then the other school that I discussed. Next, turning to the Tennessee Voluntary Pre-K program. Those of you may be familiar with this program, but this was a randomized controlled trial of Tennessee's pre-K program. It was a statewide evaluation. Children were randomly assigned off wait lists. And findings from this study focusing on math and literacy. Literacy is the blue line, math is the red line. These are treatment impacts, so the treatment group compared to the control condition. We see actually fairly strong, medium to large-ish effects at the end of pre-K. So children that went to the Tennessee Voluntary Pre-K program did better than their control counterparts on literacy and math at the end of that pre-K program. However, effects began to fade rapidly, and we see that by third grade, those effects actually turned negative. So meaning that kids that went to the Tennessee Voluntary Pre-K program were doing worse compared to those that were randomly assigned to the control. Those effects continued to grow into sixth grade, with children still performing worse that went to the pre-K program compared with those that did not. We start to see additional findings emerge in sixth grade, including more school offenses for those children that went to pre-K compared to those who did not. And those are disciplinary infractions from the school. We also see children at sixth grade having received more special education services for those that went to pre-K compared with those that did not. Next, the Head Start Impact Study. So again, many of you may be familiar with this study in the room, but the Head Start Impact Study was a congressionally mandated study that required a national sample of Head Start centers as well as Head Start children. So this was a randomized controlled trial. In 2002, it began with children randomly assigned off wait lists again to go to Head Start or not. Again, for those of you that are familiar, you might be familiar that there was two cohorts of children, a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old cohort. We focus only on the 4-year-old cohort here because, again, as you might know, the 3-year-old cohort, it was a 1-year random assignment design. So 3-year-olds that were randomly assigned to the control condition had the opportunity as 4-year-olds to go to Head. So looking only at the 4-year-old findings, we see at the end of that Head Start year, there is a very clear effect on children's language and literacy outcomes. However, at the end of the Head Start year, there's no difference on math outcomes or social emotional skills. Then children were followed up into first grade. Again, for the 4-year-old cohort, we see near complete fade out of the effects of Head Start by the end of first grade. Again, those of you familiar with this study know that there was another third grade follow-up. Third grade shows even fewer results and an inconsistent direction in third grade. But really the story here is a complete fade out of effect from the Head Start and Head Start. So taking a step back, we now ask, what about the effects of programs over time? Do we see a difference in the effectiveness of programs that operated in the 1960s through 2010? And this graph is from Greg Duncan and Catherine Magnuson's work. And the bubbles on the screen represent a single study that are weighted effectively by sample size. So those with larger samples are giving are having more weight to this trend line. And over time, you see that the effect at the end of treatment on children's cognitive development is decreasing across time and studies. So overall, we're seeing a smaller effect at the end of treatment for children that participate in a early childhood intervention. We also look at this by fade out. So understanding that there's quicker fade out for newer cohorts or newer programs. So this is a study that is in, or I should say, sorry, a graph that's in our paper that is actually coming from Emma Hart, Tyler Watts, and Drew Bailey's new meta-analysis. And they're able to look at RCTs only that operated from 1960 through 1999, and then from 2000 to 2011. And we asked the same question at the X and Y axis here for at the end of the treatment, you may see if the immediate effect looks different for when the programs operate. And we do see quite a difference in effect at the end of treatment. We also see a faster fade out of effect for programs that are operating more currently. So if you look at the blue line, even though the slopes look like they are parallel or the lines look like they are parallel, the slope for the blue line is actually steeper, showing that the average end of treatment effect is less as time goes on compared to the orange. So this was a really interesting look at not only what the slide before showed, end of treatment impacts are different, but also we're seeing quicker fade out for our newer programs. So as you can see, these are really puzzling findings, and we need to understand what they mean and what we should expect from our current programs in order to make the best policy and practice recommendations that we can. So we focused on 4 theories that are prevalent in the literature, thinking about what these theories are mean for the programs and whether they're actually supported by the literature and could explain why effects from our newer programs differ, or modern day programs differ from those classical or demonstration programs. So the first theory that we explored was program quality. And this theory asks really, is modern day program quality lower than those of the demonstration program? And before I jump into this theory specifically, I want to say there's good reason to think that the quality of these small scale Abecedarian and Perry was a lot higher than our modern day program. That has to do a lot with the scales. It's very, very small samples with lots of intensive oversight and lots of fidelity to the treatment. And also the types of services that we're offering. Perry and Abecedarian both provided lots of health services or health referrals to children. So I'll talk more about this when we get into the counterfactual conditions, but this is really a 2-point issue here that we have separated from quality, thinking about scale up and then the counterfactual. So thinking about quality overall and the quality standards, we think there's actually really good evidence to argue that program quality has increased over time, given our policy. We have rigorous Head Start program performance standards and state licensing requirements for programs that are not necessarily Head Start or pre-K programs, but are licensed child care facilities. And these requirements mandate specific levels of teacher education, teacher professional development, group size, ratios, and other structural characteristics that we think might be really important to having safe programs that promote children's health and well-being. We've also put an emphasis, given research, on the importance of teacher-child interactions on building continuous quality improvement systems at a policy level. So many states and some localities have developed quality rating and improvement systems that are meant to increase the quality, the overall quality, both structural, but really that process quality, to increase that quality that's happening within childcare and early care and education centers and in home-based care. Additionally, Tennessee, which is sometimes talked about as potentially having lower quality, actually met 9 of the 10 NEAR quality benchmarks. For those of you not familiar, NEAR is the National Institute for Early Education Research and puts out a state of the year yearbook that describes, yearbook is a better way to say that, yearbook that describes pre-K programs each year and the quality standards that they might be. So Tennessee, during that evaluation, met 9 of the 10, including teacher qualification. Additionally, we think that if program quality was an issue, you would not see strong end of treatment impact. So this graph, switching lanes a little bit, shows end of treatment impacts for programs that were evaluated using a regression discontinuity design using a birthday cutoff. So the effects here are from a different sample and look a lot larger than what I showed previously for Tennessee because it is a different research method being used. And again, regression discontinuity designs have been shown to show larger effects than RCTs. But what the takeaway here is that across 8 studies, Tennessee is actually on the higher range of end of treatment effects. In fact, there's about a 1 standard deviation impact on children's letter word identification at the end of. Similarly, there is a substantial effect, nearly half a standard deviation, on children's applied problems, math achievement at the end of treatment. And this is well within the range, in fact, kind of on the higher end of the range of 16 other studies from state or localities. And to put this into perspective, we have put Boston up on the screen in purple here to show as Boston is often heralded, rightfully so, as a very high quality program. So we see that Boston results are very similar to Tennessee results at the end of treatment. Again, we think this is pretty good evidence that program quality is at least sufficiently high enough compared to the counterfactual or compared to conditions that children are in that are not Boston pre-K or not Tennessee to boost those end of treatment. Another theory that's commonly talked about is the subsequent environment or the sustaining environment. So does the environment that children are in after pre-K matter for sustaining that pre-K group? Before I go into some evidence here, I want to say this is an area where our research team thinks there needs to be a lot more evidence. We don't have a definitive answer here. And we particularly have an issue where children are randomly assigned to pre-K and then select their subsequent environment. So we have a selection concern with where children are going next. We don't have studies that then randomly assign children to go to a different environment that would allow us to test this in a real rigorous way. Yeah.
The Boston study went all the way through high school, and the other ones seem to end around 6th grade at the latest. Has anybody continued?
It's a great question, and we actually believe that's one of the major areas of research that needs to happen. Boston is our only end of high school study from a modern day program. That's an excellent point. Okay, so with this sustaining environments question, we have that issue of selection, and we also have just really not enough research in this area to make a definitive claim. But the research that we do have, there's a meta-analysis done by Drew Bailey and colleagues that shows really no effect of the sustaining environments hypothesis. So meaning kids that are in high quality early childhood and then high quality subsequent elementary environments do better than kids that are in lower quality pre-K or lower quality subsequent early elementary environments. One study has tested this. This is out in the Society for Research in Child Development Monogram, led by Tyler Watts. And they look at North Carolina's pre-K expansion. And they have a little bit of a natural experiment where they look at, as counties rolled out pre-K, they're able to look at how investments into pre-K had long-lasting effects on children's achievement. So this study is looking at the effect of pre-K on children's grade 5 achievement. Additionally, the authors looked at environments children were in before, after, and during pre-K to understand if there was some sort of sustaining environment. If there was a sustaining environment hypothesis, it would mean that children that were in high quality pre-K and high quality subsequent environments would do better than kids that are not in those high quality environments. If there was a complementary effect or a compensatory effect, excuse me, it would mean that children that were in high quality pre-K that then transitioned to a lower quality environment or an environment where there was more adversity would potentially have a protective effect from that high quality early childhood experience. If there is an additive effect, it means that the environment before, after, or during has an additional effect on children's achievement outside of that pre-K effect. So really, in statistical terms, there's no significant interaction is what that would be. Like there was a main effect of that environment. So looking at what the authors find, in red would be that sustaining environment effect, and they find no evidence that there's any sustaining environment effect. So no evidence of being in high quality pre-K and then a high quality environment leading to better outcomes. They find some compensatory effects. So children that were in those high quality NC pre-K programs then went to schools with lower school achievement composites, had some sort of protective effect. Same with schools that were receiving more per pupil expenditures, which is really an understanding of if there was more dollars flowing that might be correlated with poverty levels in. So again, compensatory effects, but no sustaining environment effects, and some additive effects, meaning there was no impact. Next, I turn to a theory that has even less evidence behind it on what is happening kind of over time in large scale pre-K expansions and pre-K programs. But this theory really focuses on, can the instructional mode and focus of the instructional content explain why effects differ in our modern day programs compared with those from earlier, like Abecedarian and Gregarian. We have not great data on this. We have lots of global quality measures. So if you look, you will see lots of measures on the ECHRs or the class, which are ratings of how high quality or the quality of overall environments. But we don't have lots of in-depth assessments of what is happening in a preschool classroom. We don't have a lot of information on how much time is spent in teacher directed versus small group versus individual child, or the content of that instruction and how that content is being delivered. In places where we do have some estimates about the frequency of academic instruction throughout a morning, we see that reading instruction is actually increasing. If you look from the 2000 NCEBL states all the way up to the 2016 University of North Carolina Early Learning Network, there's more of a focus on early literacy, which in a lot of places meant letter word identification, which are skills that children easily develop in kindergarten. So it's not surprising that you see major catch-up in kindergarten, as letter word identification is something that's happening very early in kindergarten and is a skill that is very malleable in children's education. So this is an area where we think there's a lot more research to be done, and we don't have a clear understanding beyond those quality measures that are collected at the state or local. Lastly, we focus on the counterfactual conditions. What are the changing societal conditions that might be mattering for why we're seeing different effects, again, from those earlier cohorts of Head Start or from Perry and Abecedarian? Basically, we're asking, is there a change in what children would have access to if they were not in a preschool program? So we ask or look first at the demographic characteristics, focusing on the bottom income quintile from 1960 to the bottom income quintile in 2019, as we think that income, it would be most eligible or most likely to be eligible for the preschool programs that are targeted by income. And what do we find? Over time, there's fewer children in the home, which likely means that there's more availability for time to be invested in child development, more monetary expenses or money to be invested in children's early achievement. We also see that maternal labor force is increasing, again, likely adding to more time or more money to be invested in those early years of children's development. The last finding that I'll highlight here is that maternal education is also increasing over time. We see that by 2019, there is approximately, or on average, about 11 years of education compared to 1960, where there was around 9 years of education. These demographic characteristics are also backed up by other research that shows that over time, parents are investing more in children's development, not only in the time that they're spending, particularly paternal figures spending more time with children, but also money being spent. And some of that obviously is going to childcare, speaking from personal experience there, but some of that is going to other enrichment activities in the home. So overall, this demographic characteristic table is really showing that over time, there's likely more enrichment. The home environment is becoming more enriching. Yeah, I mean, the family structure looks to be changing as well. The single mothers are changing, becoming much more prevalent from 1960 to 2000.
Does that sound like deterioration? It's better to have two parents.
Well, it seems like the literature is showing that having more adults around the child is best for promoting a positive home environment. But not to say that, one adult cannot do that as well, but definitely a change in the vision. It's an important point. We also see increases in spending on social programs across time. So again, from 1960 to 2019, these are all in 2023 dollars. We see that the amount of dollars that the federal government is investing per child is increasing dramatically over time, as is per pupil spending. The blue bar is 1960 and the green gold bar is 2019. The second graph shows investments in social safety net programs. And here you see that there is no blue bar except for in TANF or AFDC. And what this indicates is that there is just a big increase in the social safety net. And this we think is a really good thing, right? This is providing support to children and families through these social programs and through per child investments, both in the K-12 sector and through federal child expenditures like the EIs. So basically the social security and safety net is increasing supporting children and families, which could lead to a lessening of the early childhood effects. We think overall this is a really good thing. This is a good positive finding, but it also means we need to now understand how to adapt our programs to best meet the needs of children and families. We also see over time that participation in preschool is expanding. More children are enrolled in Head Start. States are rolling out pre-K programs, and more 4-year-old children specifically are participating in this program. So overall, there's more access to ECE and more participation in those areas. So really, we think that these two theories are worth the most exploration in the future in terms of why we aren't seeing the same effects, but also in looking forward and how you develop programs to, again, best promote children's development in the short and long. So our paper, if you've read it, is short on considerations for practice and policy, but we do have lots of ideas for future research. One, we think that we need to understand a lot more about what is realistic when you scale up programs. What should be expected? We don't think that scaling up programs, though, is able to be used to say that this is why we have negative or null subsequent outcomes, because we all see that positive end of treatment impact from our pre-K program. We also think there needs to be a better understanding, like I've mentioned several times, of these instructional practices that are going on in pre-K programs, and what is the lasting effect of those instructional programs? What are those practices that best lead to those long-term outcomes? And how can policy best promote the evidence base that we see in smaller scale studies to larger scale pre-K rollouts? And lastly, for methods matter and are really important. We need these strong research designs, these causal research designs from lotteries or RCTs to best answer these research questions, and the longitudinal designs are needed to understand long-term effectiveness. A really great point was brought up that we only have the Boston pre-K program with the end of high school or further outcomes. As far as we are aware, as far as I'm personally aware, there is no plans to follow up the Head Start impact study, even though that those children are now 20 years old or in their 20s. It's really important because Boston is actually showing us something that maybe these middle term or middle effects or medium term effects aren't nearly as important, and we need to look longer. So not following up the Head Start impact study doesn't allow us to answer. Lastly, while we do these longitudinal designs, we have, again, those global quality measures, but they are not allowing us to understand the detailed practices that are happening in the classroom that might be most predictive of children's long-term development. So it's not just a need to follow children longitudinally, but to collect detailed and in-depth data in their preschool and subsequent environments to understand the effectiveness of programs as we move. Thank you all so much. Pleasure to be here. Happy to talk and answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous to hear you talk about it in person. It's a great paper and a really nice chance, I think, in many ways to spotlight early ed and where we are as a nation and where we are on these issues of social policy and where early childhood fits in our overall strategy for educating the population. I'm not going to repeat all kinds of things that certainly resonated with lots of folks in this room thinking hard about these issues as well. But I'll say a few things that I think are worth pulling out. And in some ways, I think it was Sean Reardon about 15 years ago who really introduced us to this notion of optimization and sort of a parenting and family approach to raising children and thinking about their potential very early on. And I think that partly comes through. What I wanted to add there too is at the same time as lots of federal and state investments, we have had a proliferation in the last 15 to 20 years at the community level, right? At the level of the hospitals and the pediatricians and philanthropy, birth to 8 initiatives have proliferated. We have, hundreds of 3rd grade reading campaigns that have a heavy emphasis on 0 to 5. We have home visiting that is very aggressive in certain ways, meeting parents, getting the parents, maternal screening for depression that is leading to. So I think we can't also underestimate this counterfactual, right? Which is we have now a culture where learning and education in many ways starts at birth or is becoming sort of commonplace and accepted that we take that first 60 years and months, 60 months of life and think about it in educational terms, and parents have certainly caught on and the communities have too. So that's one thing I just wanted to underscore. I think the other piece in all of this is really how we use the term quality, right? And what do we mean when a program is high quality? So our policies and our implementation of state and federal policies, and certainly this is bringing me right back to many board meetings over 8 years. The levers are very structural, right? So you hear about degrees, asking educators to have degrees, sending them to trainings, right? Putting physical, looking hard at physical space and visuals and the kinds of things that are in some ways very concrete and tangible. And then we call it high quality. And when we look very closely at what we might consider quality at the level of growing a child's mind and body, right? We're not in a structural space. Those are important sort of large scale strategies, and we need that for policy making. But the growing the little mind and body is really at the level of the interaction. And so Stephanie Jones and I have a very large scale study running, first of its kind, representative at the level of the settings and the children, all the way from very informal settings, friends, family, neighbor care, through to what are, public pre-K programs, private pay, Bright Horizons, et cetera. If you look closely at those data, and the study team is sitting over there, you can find, quote unquote, exceptionally high quality practices in what would be considered very low quality settings in certain ways, and vice versa. Because we're talking about emotional tenor, diversity of vocabulary practices back and forth at the level of child, not the recitation that we see in the letter word identification kind of practices. So, so this is all to say, building from this fabulous thinking in this great paper, I think in some ways the good news story is we're starting to bump up against really precise questions about how we grow what is a human capital enterprise. We have educators on the front line who themselves need support to manage their own stress and the emotional labor and the complexity of the job. And we have families thinking hard about where their children end up, and we have communities and states and the nation sort of mobilized in certain ways. So just want to say again, thank you. I think there's lots of folks in this room who probably have lots of questions, everything from the design of these studies to the measurement to the overall changes at the macro level and how we see those show up. So thanks again.
Thank you. And I'm not a head nodder, but I nodded to everything you said because that is just complete agreement. And those are the conversations we're having, particularly around quality, right? Like we have these really good structural measures of quality, and then you go in and you see these classrooms and you're like, well, you're meeting those requirements, but you're not doing what we would think would be a high quality practice at all. The serve and return is not there. The vocabulary development is not there. We're seeing those literacy practices increase, but not the really, really rich conversations that should be going on between a teacher or an educator and their child or peer to peer. So absolutely, I just, yeah, completely agree.
Let me say two other things that I meant to say, just building off of that. One is we do have some work we did in Head Starts, where if we can get the teacher to a skill level where she or he can get them in small groups and doing that kind of small group work, we really see an immediate bump in the quality at the process level. The only other thing I'll say, because there are lots of K-12 folks in the room, you know, some of this is starting to show up in the K-12 literacy work too, which is it looks like it's getting harder and harder to move the needle on measures of reading comprehension with the same kind of interventions that looked really good about 20 years ago. So that's been sort of interesting as well. Okay, I have a question, kind of specifically on the Tennessee side of the study. So I was in Tennessee before I was here, and I was shocked to hear you call it high quality, just because the conversation in Tennessee is that it is not high quality, and very like instruction based, not a lot of time for play, not very child-centered, huge ratios, etc. So if I was a Tennessee legislator and I saw this, I would stop funding preschool if you're telling me it's high quality and not having effects. And so I'm just curious, like, is there like concerns over the implications of like how legislators who are already not super excited to fund preschool might react to this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm not going to speak specifically for what has happened in Tennessee, but the researchers, Dale Farron and Mark Quincy, have been lots of communication with Tennessee about this, and they have made lots of quality improvements, particularly based on. But I think your question actually goes back to the conversation we were having right before that, right? Those structural indicators, those near benchmarks are you can meet them, right? And then you can have classrooms that are not developmentally appropriate, where you're not seeing those play-based instruction that's promoting a lot of language development, which we think might be really important for the long term. When we talk with legislatures and when we've had about this study, we are really careful in saying that this pre-K is a needed support, right? Pre-K, early childhood education is a needed support for families. We need to understand what makes it best. And we live in a world where both Tennessee and Boston exist. So Boston has really impressive findings, but null effects through, I think it's 9th grade until those behavioral outcomes come online. So we have to look at this picture as a whole and understand that, yes, programs might be changing in terms of their effectiveness, but there's still potential for them to be really beneficial. And we need to understand how best to make them that way so they can be scaled up, not just in Boston, but in other houses.
Thanks, Anna. I'm particularly interested in the counterfactual explanations, the potential explanations. And one of the most basic ones that you touched on was just the increase in access to formal childcare. And so I guess I'm curious whether you all have looked at the study to sort of find out some kids in the access study where they gain access to care
have some studies have evidence of counterfactual approach or in don't know them. And interestingly, I didn't know that the Delaware were controversial on this particular paper, but 50% of the abecedarian control condition was actually center-based as well. But we think likely the services they were receiving actually very different than abecedarian. Right. We have evidence in the Head Start Impact Study and in Tennessee of where kids were, but we don't have information on the quality of those settings, not even really at that global level or what those kids would do. So we haven't dug in and looked across all of the studies to see where kids would be. But I think that there's some evidence coming out from Klein and Walters and others that maybe if you look at the counterfactual condition and you compare kids that like went to Head Start and then would have gone to Head Start if they were assigned, but actually stayed home. Head Start does produce better outcomes in the first grade or at the end of treatment if they've only gone to, but we haven't done that the exact same.
So I think the simple explanation that was originally offered is still the most persuasive one. We know from lots of other research that when you scale an experiment that seems to work really well in a particular place and time, you lose a lot. And we just had a presentation a couple of weeks ago that looked at tutoring, which we look at it at small scale. It looks like you can have incredible impacts. Then you introduce it at scale, and the impacts don't go away, but they certainly attenuate dramatically. So you could easily explain the finding that the early studies are two studies that were very carefully designed, both on the policy side or the institutional fidelity side, and then tracked over a very long period of time. So, but then the more recent, Head Start, if you just remember how Head Start was initiated, it's sort of a political operation and wasn't even, it's had so many political interventions over the years that for it to be a well-defined, high-fidelity program is, you have to be skeptical about that, whatever the formal indicators are. Because formal indicators, as has been suggested here, cannot necessarily a good measure of the genuine quality. So, and the Tennessee one, I always heard somebody else speak to that. And yeah, the formal indicators look like it's great there in Tennessee, but do we really think those formal indicators are what's really important in terms of education? So that just leads me back to the basic point of just really scale.
I completely agree with the scaling piece of it, but if the scale was the issue, I come back to that point that I showed it in the quality section. We would not see end of treatment effects. Because those are compared to kids that are in other preschool programs, right? That are experiencing the counterfactual. So if we thought that the program was completely diluted and was the same as potentially what was out in the community, I don't think we would expect to see any differences on children's early math and literacy after they've completed that. I also should say that there are effects from the early Head Start cohort, long-lasting effects. Martha Bailey has a really great paper out that looks at this and finds that Head Start in those early cohorts was most effective in places where there were lower resources, likely indicating, again, that counterfactual, that places where there were not the medical and dental supports available, Head Start really provided a need in that community, which could be the mechanism for that one.
That's a very good point. And
with me that we don't. We want that follow, right? We want that long-term head start impact study follow-up to see if we're seeing those tangible effects of high school graduation like we saw in Boston. Because if it turns out that those pencil and paper null effects are fade out, don't seem to matter, it's really those long-term ones. I think that's a really positive finding for childhood, but as of right now, we don't have that. We only have it in Boston. And hopefully and those places, those early parent education places, are what we're looking at in the preschool, and particularly. But I think your point about it being good is yes, we have to make sure that those places where children are spending significant amounts of time for are high quality and promote their development.
Hi, thank you for being here. Um, so we think a lot in our program about making the case uh, for the quality early education. Do you have any kind of suggestions about how we can go out into the field and make that strong case, even though, the findings that you showed us are complex? Because I just think about how many policy memos or papers I've written this year that rely on that really strong evidence base. And it's really helpful to see the nuance in it, but how do you make the case within the complexity of your findings?
Wonderful question. I think there's a lot of temptation. Greg Duncan calls it, this is not my term, but Greg Duncan calls it the Perry preschool shuffle, right? That we promise what happened in Perry is going to happen in all of our pre-K programs. And I think that first of all, we have to stop, right? We see now here that the evidence is actually much more complex and it's puzzling. It's a puzzle. So there's a case to be made that you can make really strong impacts at the end of preschool, but I think we don't have a clear understanding of what happened after that for our modern program. So high quality preschool can be important not only for children's development, but could also be potentially important. There's some evidence on this of supporting workforce, supporting particularly mothers that enter the workforce, with them working more hours and they have access to care. So I think there's lots of arguments that can be made, but I tend to stay really close to the evidence here that we have to be careful that we don't overpromise.
I'm thinking about just preschool. I have two toddlers and they were at an expensive, very highly regulated and watched program. And my daughter can just 4 now and she could write her name and knew all the alphabet. They had high teacher turnover, really young people working at the center who didn't seem super invested, and her behavior started to decline pretty significantly. So while she could meet academic benchmarks, behaviorally and socially, she was declining. And we moved her into a more kind of traditional run-of-the-mill preschool program that had kept teachers there for 20 years or longer in some cases. And she improved dramatically. And the teacher commented in the mid-school review, "Oh, wow, she can write her name. Nobody else in the class can." So I'm just thinking, what are these quality benchmarks and are they actually serving the kids, or are they serving policy and data? Because if you look at it over time, we're seeing, null or decreasing effects, but increasing social support requirements, quality kind of indicators. I'm just wondering, are what we're measuring actually serving kids?
question. I'm sure lots of thoughts on that as well, but I think that this is something that comes back to, we really put in place structural features of care to keep kids safe. So lots of licensing requirements are right on the safety requirements. But when we think about those continuous quality improvement systems, the QRISs, what are those targeting? And that's where we need, like, there's really awesome work happening in this room, but understanding those practices that you can then think about measuring and also promoting to scale up. And whether it is that letter word, name writing skills, or more of the social emotional, which we probably develop in more development. But yeah, so I think there's an easy answer to your question. It's important. Oh, I think.
Hey, this is great. I'm wondering, like I think a lot of pre-K or early childhood education is provided by like private entities, right? I know there's like a growing sector of like private equity firms that are buying up early childhood education centers. I'm wondering, like, is there any evidence to talk about like the effectiveness of those types of programs? And I'm wondering, is that eventually going to be the case to like privatize all of early childhood education too? So you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
I don't know of any evidence on that. I know that it's the fastest growing, or maybe the only growing sector of early care and education right now. Anecdotally, just from my personal experience and from experience with people that I know, a lot of those private programs opt out of like QRISs or accreditations, so they're not being even involved in kind of those quality systems. But I don't know of any. I should say there is one study by Dr. Bassick and colleagues that looked at it in the UCLS maybe, or maybe the B. Don't look at. I mean, you can find it, but they find that those programs are lower quality in terms of what we see in publicly funded programs. But again, these are on quality measures that we then don't necessarily see turning into being predictive of children's development.
Just one addendum, we do actually have unprecedented growth at state level in investments in public investment. So you're right, it's a very private sector, there's an interesting activity, but just so we're all clear, like at scale, I think we've had the most investment at the state level, partly spurred by the COVID dollars, but also those seem to have been a catalyst for a lot more activity. One other comment would just be, I think that we could all think probably about two things. Perhaps pushing ourselves to be clear when we say quality, what our kind of paradigm is for quality, and when quality measured, structurally versus process, et cetera. But the second is, what is it that we want from these programs? In other words, you just worry about the story that they're not holding up when in fact the end of program effect looked like, well, in certain ways, that was a really good investment, right? Families were working, children were safe, their minds and bodies were growing, et cetera. So I think there's this other piece, which is like, what is it that we want here? And what's the actionable next step?
I absolutely agree with thinking about what the purpose of the program is, right? And like what you should expect from them. I think a concern of mine, and I know of my colleagues, is that sometimes the conversation can get switched to saying, well, they're null, right? Because it's the fade out. That's educational negative, right? So I think we have to take those seriously and be concerned. We have to take those seriously. It's one state. There are two other studies that have come out that I did not cover, but they are in our paper because we think they're concerned with the random lottery design. They also show negative. So I will not talk about them, but you can look at the paper and talk about them there. It will probably be removed from the next version. But there's starting to be potential concern of what is happening that could be producing negative outcomes. And if that's happening, then I think we do need to be a little bit more concerned about those end of, if the end of treatment is positive, what are the long?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say to that, I couldn't agree more, and I really appreciate the need to look at all and to have a really honest conversation about it. I think the one narrative that needs some exploration is that it was an early start to a pipeline that was about SPED and special ed, early identification, and not in the supplemental, right? Not in the enrichment, but it's set them on path that we see in their disciplinary data and in their side. I think that would be the unintended consequence. right? And or just the reality of more eyes on those kids with a demographic profile that you know is at risk for that kind of happen.
I apologize for not having the but I was thinking this is the thing about sizes across the different years things, so like one way to increase this interaction, right, through the distribution. Another is to change the variance. And so thinking about like perhaps like widening the quality that is happening over the past few decades, like how should we be considering that? That's a good question. We don't actually, I mean, in that study, they don't actually make those kind of quality kind of comparisons that you'll be thinking about with the widening of the quality, but that could definitely be happening. And there's some good evidence within the Head Start impact study itself that there was quite a bit of variation in quality in those programs that participated. There were 383 centers, I think, that participated around that number, but there's huge variation in quality that children are participating in. So I think we have to, take that into consideration, especially the scale up question too, right? As you move from these very, very small studies, that you can control the quality and have a very clear understanding of what is going on in the program, to moving to larger scale, you lose that oversight in a way that like gives you that wider span. That could be leading to, if that's here. Okay.
I asked a question, which somewhat gets back to the conversation about what do we measure and what do we expect. I think, as we're all aware, a few years ago, it seems to have faded a little bit. There was this concern about sort of the language gap or the word gap that lower income students had coming in kindergarten. That was sort of holding back. Sort of park that on one side for a second, and then the second piece of this, which relates to the slide you had, which showed sort of structural effect, as well as connecting sort of the other sort of structural policy investments, where there may have been, and we talked about this for today, there may have been a little bit of shift, towards kind of direct instruction. So like if you're in letter recognition, being like, okay, let's work on that today. We'll spend the first half hour focused on that, and then there's certainly some other things that are more consistent with, for lack of a better word, traditional K-12 kind of experiences as opposed to the informal kind of days experiences that children might have in earlier. So all that, wrapping that up, I guess, is I'm wondering if we may be seeing some additional focus on math, but actually less focus on. And then having said all that, whether that matters or not in terms of long-term outcomes, getting back to this point, I'm not sure we're ever really going to know the answer to that. I think most people would feel it's a good thing, even if it doesn't really result in a significant use.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And this is something should be my calling up. That's big purchase, right? Is that we've moved to this literacy, letter word identification when we've given up on what Harry actually found. And there's a really good implementation report. You have to dig pretty deep to find it, but there is a quote in there that says that Perry Preschool, the observations were showing what the writer of this report said was verbal bombardment of children, that they were just being talked to all the time. There's so much language happening in the classroom that they were just experiencing that and able to learn a lot of language that then was potentially the reason why we saw these lasting effects. So I think your point is a really good one, and you just don't have that data to understand what those interactions are doing and what, if we're seeing more, letter word versus or language.
And just also the problem with that is it's pretty hard to regulate a language. That's so
right.
We tend to focus on things.
And I believe I shared this with you, but we had a preschool teacher reach out, and I love talking to preschool teachers. So she reached out to talk to me about the study. She had found it on a blog or something and had contacted me, and she said, yes, we are taught the play, the play curriculum. We're taught about developmentally appropriate practices. I've been a teacher for 27 years. But now I have to assess every child in my class 3 times a year on 50 indicators. And she actually did the math for me, but it worked out that she was entering 5,000 data points about children in her class each school year. And a lot of that was focused on literacy development with some language. So I don't think it's surprising that we're seeing potentially a disconnect from what we think about and teach in our pre-service teaching educator classes to then what actually has to happen in practice when you're going through and doing these assessments to check on children's progress and also working with them on letter word identification. Something more exciting.
I know that it might be hard to make those connections, but what can the international experience tell us? I mean, the kids, people doing research on it, just because it's not in the United States, we sort of sometimes just do this and say, well, it won't apply.
Right, right. It's an excellent question, and I'm going to give a really unfulfilling answer is that we've stuck just with the US base of research, but your question is one that impacts a lot of for me. Well, what can we learn from international context, or can we put these findings in international comparison? We decided to kind of stay it out. But excellent question.
So, further questions, any final thoughts, concluding remarks?
No, this is exactly what we're hoping is this discussion and debate and honest dialogue. So thank you again for having me. It's been a real
Great, thank you so much. And next week over at Taubman, we'll have Tom Campbell.